In this video, we're going to be talking about the science of disease and how you have the power to change your genetics through changing belief systems and perception. I run a coaching company where I teach people how to live a healthy lifestyle and think healthy thoughts in order to reverse metabolic syndrome. I also certify personal trainers. So my goal for this video is to provide some clarity and aid in shifting from a victim perspective to an empowered perspective. I will include all the books that I read that contributed to this video in the link below. Disease happens because of how we see the world. In order to be really healthy, we need to know ourselves. In order to understand ourselves, we need to understand our cells. The human body is a machine made up of trillions of moving parts in the form of what we call cells. Cells work together in harmony, and it's why you are able to talk, eat, build things, drive, and maintain homeostasis. Disease is when your cells are not working in harmony. If you were put into a shrinking machine like Ant-Man and shrunk down to the size of a cell and then put into your own body, if you are healthy, you would experience a metropolis of people and events moving harmoniously towards a common goal. If you, as a shrunken person, experienced a diseased body, you would have a less harmonious and chaotic experience with like riots and war and famine. As humans, we are not single entities. We are part of a community of billions of other people. When we feel disharmony and dis-ease, that is because that is how we are seeing the world. So when you as a cell feel confused and threatened, you won't be able to help the people around you, which leads to emotions of depression and hopelessness. So the question still stands, is disease predetermined by genetics? I want to create a picture in your mind of being a small moving part in a larger entity like a cell, because it explains why disease occurs from an environmental point of view. First, I want to dig a little bit deeper on the environmental experiments done on cells in the mid-1900s. But before I do that, here is a mini crash course on the history of science so we can understand when our beliefs about the human body began to shift. In early science, so the late 1500s, the church was at the head of science, and the belief was that our body is an expression of God because we are made in God's image. The mission statement before conventional science was to understand nature and therefore understand God. It was called natural theology. So the belief was that God's hand was directly involved in the unfoldment of reality we see around us. Our only job was to understand the nature of the environment and live in harmony with it. So science largely was just the act of being in nature and not really questioning the reality we see around us. Now, obviously, it is within our nature as humans to question things. And the more people questioned things, the more the church tried to suppress them. The suppression of knowledge by the church brought on the Reformation, which challenged the church's authority in science. That's when Isaac Newton discovered a new type of calculus called differential calculus, which he used to create an equation to predict the movement of the solar system. This created a shift in the mission statement of science, which was to control and dominate nature, which is very different from the previous mission statement, which was to understand nature and therefore understand God. Early scientists became obsessed with this question. What exactly is it that controls our traits and behaviors from conception? Great question. enter Darwin. He showed that physical traits are connected to ancestry. So that was all cool for a while. And then scientists were like, okay, but then what part of the cell really controls life? What they really wanted to understand was the underlying force that creates all life. Since we had just separated science and spirituality through the Reformation, our perspective had shifted to more black and white. We wanted science to be able to explain everything and disregard spirituality altogether. In 1944, an experiment was conducted to understand what controls life, because science was still all about control and domination. This experiment involved chromosomes, which are 50% protein and 50% DNA. They took two types of bacteria and their chromosomes, so they had a type R and a type S bacteria. It was discovered that type R bacteria and type S bacteria produced two different types of colonies. Makes sense. Now, this is where it gets interesting. Type S bacteria protein was combined with type R DNA. So taking the 50% of type S that's protein and then the 50% of type R that's DNA, and the type R DNA changed its shape and started to express type S traits. In other words, the DNA changed its expression because its environment changed. Type R DNA stopped expressing itself as type R DNA and started expressing itself as DNA to match the proteins from type S, because it's what needed to happen in order for it to survive in that environment. So then there was a research study done on the genes of happy people compared to the genes of unhappy people. And what they found was that happy people had a different genetic expression than unhappy people. And because we didn't yet have the understanding we do now of how genes are expressed, unhappy people built this victim mentality thinking they were unhappy because it was just how they were born and there was nothing they could do about it. So this is what we know after these two studies. DNA changes its expression based on its environment, and the genetics of happy versus unhappy people are different. So that makes sense. The missing piece is understanding what or who is in control of that genetic expression. In 1953, it was shown that DNA is a helix structure, which is that spiral helix structure commonly known today. Each strand contains a blueprint to make proteins. And human behavior, emotions, and function is made up of proteins, so they're pretty important. So the blueprint, aka the DNA, is read like a book. The RNA carries that message into the cell, and the cell forms proteins that are released from the cell to bind to other cells. What we experience as emotion is proteins being released from cells and binding to other cells. So emotion is the release of proteins from some cells to bind to other cells in your entire body. Another name for these proteins is peptides and neurotransmitters. Some of the more commonly known neurotransmitters are oxytocin, dopamine, epinephrine, and serotonin. So inside of the cell, the DNA is being read like a blueprint. Then the RNA carries the message of that blueprint. Then the cell body gets to work to make the proteins that sustain life. Therefore, the DNA is the blueprint for the building blocks of the body, which is protein. So if the architect reading that DNA is responsible for how the cell expresses itself, the question is now, Who and what is the architect? Side note, in the early 2000s, the Human Genome Project showed that there are only 25,000 different genes and more than 100,000 types of proteins, further proving that it is impossible for DNA to dictate the fate of our behavior and health because there would need to be a gene to match each type of protein. So, DNA, RNA, protein. That process repeating, that is very, very generally how the body stays in balance and harmony, or homeostasis. A cell knows what to do and how to act based on which genes are turned on and turned off, which is when we get more into epigenetics, but that's a whole other video. Which genes are turned on and turned off is determined by the cell's ability to look at its environment and figure out how it can help. A liver cell would need to know that its job is to help with detoxing, synthesizing proteins, and digestion, because that's what the liver does. If the cell is thinking it's in a stressful environment, it will not be able to help because it will go into a state of fear. When cells are in a state of fear all the time, that's what we experience as disease because the cell can no longer contribute. As humans, we perceive our environment with our five senses. The cell perceives its environment through its membrane, which is the thin skin surrounding the cell. The membrane is made up of proteins called integral membrane proteins, IMPs, which also happens to be the acronym for my company. And this membrane controls what can bind and get into the cell. So, membrane perceives, protein binds and is allowed into the cell, which goes to the nucleus. Enzymes get to work to read that genetic blueprint. RNA carries the message into the cell body, which starts the production of a protein. That protein moves through the cell and is eventually released from the cell to carry that message or function to other cells. So it's this process of constant recycling and forming new proteins that we refer to as harmony or homeostasis. Therefore, it is not the genes that dictate our behavior and expression. It's our perception. What started that whole process was not the genes. It was the cell perceiving its environment. In the exact same way, it is not our genetics that make our fate. It is the meaning we place on things. A belief is not just a mental thing. It is something that is stored in your biology. When you feed the belief that you are unworthy, that belief is stored in your cellular memory and will change the way your cell operates. So the idea that your thoughts and beliefs are separate from your biology is not a thing. The fact of reality is the more attention you give negative thought, the more pain, disease, and unhappiness you will experience. If your perception of your reality is that you are a victim of your circumstances, your biology will respond by contracting and locking down, which leads to disharmony and disease. When you feel like you need to fight against or justify yourself to people around you, you are perceiving a very chaotic reality. The way that you change your inner state is to change the way that you see things. And the only way to find peace is to first find peace within yourself. If your perception of reality is that you live in a friendly universe and everything is working for you instead of against you, your biology will respond with feelings of harmony, peace, love, and joy. And then you will truly be able to serve the people around you in a meaningful way. Therefore, if you have been diagnosed with a disease, all it means is your biology has calibrated to negative thoughts, perceptions, and belief systems, and is waiting for you to come to the understanding that what you have been perceiving as injustice is actually an indication of your innate ability to love and uplift those around you. But you won't be able to love and uplift those around you until you can love yourself. The key to reversing disease and experiencing radical health is to change your perception of yourself. The key to living a beautiful life is to love yourself. Your biology is literally begging you to love yourself. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the bell. Also, let me know in the comments if this helps and if there are any topics mentioned today that would be fun to expand on more. Until then, remember that you have the power to change any aspect of your life, especially your health.